A fraction represents a part of a whole or, more generally, any number of equal parts. When spoken in everyday English, a fraction describes how many parts of a certain size there are, for example, 1/2, 8/5, 3/4. A common, vulgar, or simple fraction consists of an integer numerator, displayed above a line, and a non-zero integer denominator, displayed below that line. Numerators and denominators are also used in fractions that are not common, including compound fractions, complex fractions, and mixed numerals. The numerator represents a number of equal parts, and the denominator, which cannot be zero, indicates how many of those parts make up a unit or a whole. For example, in the fraction 3/4, the numerator, 3, tells us that the fraction represents 3 equal parts, and the denominator, 4, tells us that 4 parts make up a whole. The picture to the right illustrates all 3/4 of a cake. Fractional numbers can also be written without using explicit numerators or denominators, by using decimals, percent signs, or negative exponents. An integer such as the number 7 can be thought of as having an implicit denominator of 1. 7 equals 7/1. Other uses for fractions are to represent ratios and to represent division. Thus the fraction 3/4 is also used to represent the ratio 3:4 and the division 3 divided by 4. In mathematics, the set of all numbers which can be expressed in the form a, b, where a and b are integers and b is not zero, is called the set of rational numbers and is represented by the symbol q, which stands for quotient. The test for a number being a rational number is that it can be written in that form. However, the word fraction is also used to describe mathematical expressions that are not rational numbers, for example algebraic fractions, and expressions that contain irrational numbers, such as square root 2/2 and pi. 4. Vocabulary. When reading fractions, it is customary in English to pronounce the denominator using the corresponding ordinal number, in plural if the numerator is not 1, as in fifths, for fractions with a 5 in the denominator. Thus, 3/5 is rendered as 3/5 and 5/32 as 5/32. This generally applies to whole number denominators greater than 2, though large denominators that are not powers of 10 are often rendered using the cardinal number. Thus, 5/123 might be rendered as 5/123, but is often 5/123. In contrast, because 1,000,000 is a power of 10, 6/1,000,000 is usually expressed as 6/1,000,000 or 6/1,000,000. Rather than as 6/1,000,000. The denominators 1, 2, and 4 are special cases. The fraction 3/1 may be spoken of as 3 wholes. The denominator 2 is expressed as half minus 3/2, is minus 3/2 or negative 3/2. The fraction 3/4 may be either 3/4 or 3/4. Furthermore, since most fractions in prose function as adjectives, the fractional modifier is hyphenated. This is evident in standard prose, in which one might write about every 2/10 of a mile, the quarter-mile run, or the 3/5 compromise. When the fraction's numerator is 1, then the word 1 may be omitted, such as every 10th of a second, or during the final quarter of the year. In the examples 2/5 and 7/3, the slanting line is called a solidus, or forward slash. In the examples the horizontal line is called a fraction bar. When the solidus is encountered in a fraction, a speaker will sometimes pass it by pronouncing it over, as in the examples above. Forms of fractions. Simple, common, or vulgar fractions. A simple fraction is a rational number written as a, b, or where a and b are both integers. As with other fractions, the denominator cannot be 0. Examples include and 3/17. Simple fractions can be positive or negative, proper or improper. Compound fractions, complex fractions, mixed numerals, and decimals are not simple fractions, though, unless irrational, they can be evaluated to a simple fraction. Proper and improper fractions. Common fractions can be classified as either proper or improper. When the numerator and the denominator are both positive, the fraction is called proper if the numerator is less than the denominator, and improper otherwise. In general, a common fraction is said to be a proper fraction if the absolute value of the fraction is strictly less than 1, that is, if the fraction is greater than -1 and less than 1. It is said to be an improper fraction, or sometimes top-heavy fraction, if the absolute value of the fraction is greater than or equal to 1. Examples of proper fractions are 2/3, -3/4, and 4/9. Examples of improper fractions are 9/4, -4/3, and 3/3. Mixed numbers. A mixed numeral is the sum of a non-zero integer and a proper fraction. This sum is implied without the use of any visible operator such as plus. For example, in referring to 2 entire cakes and 3/4 of another cake, the whole and fractional parts of the number are written next to each other. This is not to be confused with the algebra rule of implied multiplication. When two algebraic expressions are written next to each other, the operation of multiplication is said to be understood. In algebra, for example, is not a mixed number. Instead, multiplication is understood where, to avoid confusion, the multiplication is often explicitly expressed, so may be written as, or. An improper fraction is another way to write a whole plus a part. A mixed number can be converted to an improper fraction as follows. Write the mixed number as a sum. Convert the whole number to an improper fraction with the same denominator as the fractional part. Add the fractions. The resulting sum is the improper fraction. In the example, similarly, an improper fraction can be converted to a mixed number as follows. Divide the numerator by the denominator. In the example, divide 11 by 4. 11 divided by 4 equals 2 with remainder 3. The quotient becomes the whole number part of the mixed number. The remainder becomes the numerator of the fractional part. In the example, 2 is the whole number part and 3 is the numerator of the fractional part. The new denominator is the same as the denominator of the improper fraction. In the example, they are both 4. Thus, mixed numbers can also be negative, as in, which equals. Ratios. A ratio is a relationship between two or more numbers that can be sometimes expressed as a fraction. Typically, a number of items are grouped and compared in a ratio, specifying numerically the relationship between each group. Ratios are expressed as group 1 to group 2 to group n. For example, if a car lot had 12 vehicles, of which 2 are white, 6 are red, and 4 are yellow, then the ratio of red to white to yellow cars is 6 to 2 to 4. The ratio of yellow cars to white cars is 4 to 2 and may be expressed as 4 to 2 or 2 to 1. A ratio is often converted to a fraction when it is expressed as a ratio to the whole. In the above example, the ratio of yellow cars to all the cars on the lot is 4/12 or 1 to 3. We can convert these ratios to a fraction and say that 4/12 of the cars or 1/3 of the cars in the lot are yellow. Therefore, if a person randomly chose one car on the lot, then there is a 1 in 3 chance or probability that it would be yellow. Reciprocals and the invisible denominator. The reciprocal of a fraction is another fraction with the numerator and denominator exchanged. The reciprocal of, for instance, is the product of a fraction and its reciprocal is 1, hence the reciprocal is the multiplicative inverse of a fraction. Any integer can be written as a fraction with the number 1 as denominator. For example, 17 can be written as, where 1 is sometimes referred to as the invisible denominator. Therefore, every fraction or integer except for 0 has a reciprocal. The reciprocal of 17 is complex fractions, not to be confused with fractions involving complex numbers. In a complex fraction, either the numerator, or the denominator, or both, is a fraction or a mixed number, corresponding to division of fractions. for example, and to complex fractions. To reduce a complex fraction to a simple fraction, treat the longest fraction line as representing division. For example, if, in a complex fraction, there is no clear way to tell which fraction lines takes precedence, then the expression is improperly formed, and ambiguous. Thus 5/10, 20/40 is a poorly constructed mathematical expression, with multiple possible values. Compound fractions. A compound fraction is a fraction of a fraction, or any number of fractions connected with the word "div", corresponding to multiplication of fractions. To reduce a compound fraction to a simple fraction, just carry out the multiplication. For example, of is a compound fraction, corresponding to. The terms compound fraction and complex fraction are closely related, and sometimes one is used as a synonym for the other. Decimal fractions and percentages. A decimal fraction is a fraction whose denominator is not given explicitly, but is understood to be an integer power of 10. Decimal fractions are commonly expressed using decimal notation, in which the implied denominator is determined by the number of digits to the right of a decimal separator, the appearance of which, a comma, depends on the locale. Thus for 0.75 the numerator is 75 and the implied denominator is 10 to the second power, viz. 100, because there are two digits to the right of the decimal separator. In decimal numbers greater than 1, the fractional part of the number is expressed by the digits to the right of the decimal. 3.75 can be written either as an improper fraction, 375/100ths, or as a mixed number. Decimal fractions can also be expressed using scientific notation with negative exponents, such as 6993602299999999996.023 times 10⁻⁷, which represents 0.0000006023. The 69931000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 107. Dividing by 7007100000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 Decimal fractions with infinitely many digits to the right of the decimal separator represent an infinite series. For example, 1/3 equals 0.333. Represents the infinite series 3/10 plus 3/100 plus 3/1000 plus. Another kind of fraction is the percentage, in which the implied denominator is always 100. Thus, 51% means 51/100ths. Percentages greater than 100 or less than 0 are treated in the same way, e.g., 311% equals 311/100ths, and -27% equals -27/100ths. The related concept of per mil or parts per thousand has an implied denominator of 1000, while the more general parts per notation, as in 75 parts per million, means that the proportion is 75/1,000,000ths. Whether common fractions or decimal fractions are used is often a matter of taste and context. Common fractions are used most often when the denominator is relatively small. By mental calculation, it is easier to multiply 16 by 3/16 than to do the same calculation using the fraction's decimal equivalent, and it is more accurate to multiply 15 by 1/3, for example, than it is to multiply 15 by any decimal approximation of 1/3. Monetary values are commonly expressed as decimal fractions, for example $3.75. However, as noted above, in pre-decimal British currency, shillings and pence were often given the form of a fraction, as, for example, 3/6, meaning 3 shillings and 6 pence, and having no relationship to the fraction 3/6. Special cases: a unit fraction is a vulgar fraction with a numerator of 1, e.g., unit fractions can also be expressed using negative exponents, as in 2-1 which represents 1/2, and 2-2 which represents 1, or 1/4. An Egyptian fraction is the sum of distinct positive unit fractions, for example. This definition derives from the fact that the ancient Egyptians expressed all fractions except, and in this manner, every positive rational number can be expanded as an Egyptian fraction. For example, can be written as any positive rational number can be written as a sum of unit fractions in infinitely many ways. 2 ways to write a dyadic fraction is a vulgar fraction in which the denominator is a power of 2, e.g.,